Hello everyone, myself Dr. Rajiv Sutradhar. I teaches economics at Department of Economics, Nehu Shillong campus. Today, as a part of this module, I am going to talk about economics of gender and development. In that, I am going to touch upon the module 21, in which we are going to talk about gender in the decision making process. So to begin with, if we look at the economics, the analysis of economics, there are different units of analysis. One is at the individual level, okay, and then we also do at the household level. And when it comes to household level, we talk about basically something called unitary models, in which we treat the entire household as an entity which try to maximize its utility. So in that model, basically we have certain generally what do we do in economics? In economics, we try to maximize our utilities or individuals' utility given the budget constraint. Same thing is in the unitary model. In the same thing is replicated, and there basically we try to maximize households' aggregate utility given the budget constraint. Okay, and here basically we ignore the dynamics inside within this household. We do not talk much about that. We basically talk about as a household as an entity which try to maximize its well-being. And within these households, of course, individuals allocate divisions of labor, and people perform different, family members perform different roles, and then finally the entity as a whole is considered as a household, and they try to maximize their own utilities as a whole. Okay, and here we do not focus much about what happened to the intra-household allocation of resources. Does everybody within the household perform equally good, or is it someone who basically appropriate much of the resources and others suffer? So those things do not figure much. Okay, so basically what I mean to say is that unitary model generally, you can say the rationale behind the unitary model is tenable if we assume that this household has all the family members has inside the household has the same objective. They want to do the pursue all the goals with the same intensity. Okay, there is no difference whether this is household head or it's his spouse or some other members. And then also this household head, or maybe we can also assume that this household head is a benevolent dictators. Okay, and he kind of like try to make everyone happy, and whatever decisions he takes, that is in everyone's interest. Or the third ground on which this unitary model can be applied is basically everybody has the same identical preferences. Okay, it doesn't matter who takes the decisions, since everybody has the same taste and preference. If everybody wants, say, leisure or enjoyment as much as, say, work, or some food everybody wants with equal intensity, so then it doesn't matter whoever takes the decisions. So we basically do not need to spend, if that is the case, if these three different kind of you can say typologies who do hold, so then it basically doesn't matter, who basically takes the decisions. Okay, so in that case intra household bargaining is not much of relevant. Okay, but then what we basically need to focus on is total family income, and then like what the total utility that is achieved. Okay, but once we do away from this kind of assumptions, then there is a problematic. Okay, there is some problems. So but before that, I just want to give you just one example of this. See, if here we have this x-axis, we measure food. Okay, and in the y-axis we measure entertainment, and then we have like this indifference curve, which is basically again it's a kind of family or couples indifference curve. Okay, generally just like we have an individual indifference curve, here since everybody has the same choice and pattern, so basically one indifference curve will hold good for both husband and wife. Okay, and so here it doesn't matter who earns how much. Let us assume that husband earns 40,000 and wife earns 30,000. Total family income is 70,000. So here in the equilibrium that we have is basically the indifference curve that is tangent to the budget line. The equilibrium solution is R here, and we have the equilibrium allocation of amount of money for entertainment is OE star, and for food is OF star. Okay, and so if we now tweak around the amount of income that this couple earn, let us assume that wife earns 40,000 and husband earn 30,000, then also we'll end up with this same solutions. Okay, so it doesn't matter who earns how much income. Finally, the allocations will remain same because everybody's in indifference curve is, or you can say choice or preferences are all same. Okay, so that is what we basically end up with. But then this is basically the two ideal world, and if you look at the empirical evidences of this unitary model, there are a lot of empirical tests which holds equally true in both developed and developing countries, and that's there's an enormous amount of evidence, bodies of evidence which actually testify against the validity of the unitary model. So one classic example that I can give you is the UK child benefit study. Here, basically, government initially tried to give the money for the child benefit to the father, and then later they switch around to the switch to the mothers. Okay, so they made some direct payment to the mothers, and they found that it really makes a lot of differences as to who gets the money. Okay, if the money is given to the women's, then generally women's and children's clothing increases. Okay, and then domestic service increases, their food and have a lot of things like food consumption increases. So all this, but then if you give this money to the men's, so then men's clothing, and then of course tobacco, and then alcohol, all these things actually increases. Okay, so basically if you intend to see the money spent well, specific targeted programs, then it makes sense. It makes sense for for money to be transferred to the women, and this kind of evidence is also now emerging in developing countries, in also in India. Okay, a lot of funding agencies are looking at that, and then they are advocating for this transfer of benefits to be targeted towards the women's rather than the male. Okay, and another example that I can give you is Burkina Faso agriculture. So Christopher Udrich, one very famous development economist, he found that we cannot treat this husband and wife as a part of same entity, because what he found that, like, if we give a land title to the husband and wife separately, and then he found that the money that is finally coming through say one channel, and then everything is ending up with husband. So all the fertilizers, everything is going to the plots owned by the man, and then they prioritize the plots income and all. So finally basically the plots that is owned by the women's are losing out in terms of yield. Okay, so basically it really matters who gets the money. Okay, so we have an enormous amount of evidences that testify against the validity of unitary models. So now what we see is the emergence of basically separate different models which kind of take into account this within the bargaining within the household decision making. Okay, so we cannot treat them as a one homogeneous entity, and here comes the basically bargaining theory. Okay, so in this bargaining theory, we try to understand the complex decision making within the household occurs. We allow for the differences in preferences. Okay, so now we do away with the assumptions that all the individual members within the household have the same preferences. Now that is not necessarily true, right? And so we take into account for that, and try to see the optimum solution given the budget constraint. Okay, and then who controls how much resources. Okay, now that we have this bargaining theory, it says that if there is a breakdown of this deal, so then the solution that the cooperation breakdown, so then basically the person will end up with something called trade utility. We'll come back to that more in detail later. Okay, so basically what we try to bring is that Nash bargaining framework. Nash bargaining framework is something which is applied for not just to understand the within household decision making, okay, among different members, okay, bargaining among them. Okay, it is also applied for something like between labor union and members, and then company and workers. So all some kind of cooperative bargaining models we apply this Nash bargaining framework. Okay, and here we basically talk about four key concepts. Okay, and so basically this Nash bargaining framework is now applied in the context of household decision making. Okay, so here if they cooperate, they may end up with better outcomes. If but then at the same time, finally who gets what depends on the bargaining power okay, which again depends on their initial resource, initial positions that they started with, okay. And so this entails basically with the four key concepts. One is the utility possibility frontiers, okay, and then Pareto efficiency, okay, and threat points, and then NAS product, okay. So utility possibility frontier is basically the what is the maximum combinations of well-being that can be achieved by the couple together if they basically remain stuck together, okay. And threat point is basically, you can say, in case the breakdown, this whole negotiation breakdown, and they basically opt for like quitting this whole cooperations, so then what is the level of utility that they will end up with, okay. And the third is Pareto efficiency. When they work together, they will exploit it to the maximum, and so that no scope for reallocation that will lead to someone getting better off without others not getting worse off. That kind of position is ruled out, okay. So basically, so this is what the input, the snapshot of NAS bargaining solutions. So what you will basically see here is a kind of a cooperative bargaining model, okay. NAS bargaining model, it's a cooperative. Here two parties get together to achieve a solution which they cannot achieve acting individually, okay. So marriage or household can be also conceived or can be thought of like that, okay. It's an entity where people are coming together and decide to stay together because they are better off while doing so, okay. And then they, while they stay together, they try to achieve the maximum possible well-being, okay. That is basically Pareto efficient. It is something that, like, it is not that like husband is not improving, but then wife can do something better without making husband wife off. So then those kind of solutions won't exist, basically because they will work together to eliminate those kind of inferior solutions, okay. And so this is in a snapshot the NAS bargaining model, but we will discuss more in detail now, okay. So here if you see the framework here, we are thinking of two individuals. One is Anita, okay, is a wife, and then Ramesh is the husband. This couple decide to stay together, okay. In the x-axis we are measuring Anita's utility, and in the y-axis we are measuring Ramesh's utility, okay. And we try to basically, I mean, as we move away from the origin, Anita's utility increases. So her utility is maximized at point A, right? Which is on x-axis, and similarly, Ramesh's utility is maximized on point B, okay. But then, so this is basically at point A. A's utility is maximized, but Anita's utility is maximized, but Ramesh's utility is 0. And if you go y-axis, so then Ramesh's utility is maximized, that is basically at point B, but Anita's utility is 0. But those are basically ruled out because there is something called threat point, okay. Because before the Anita and Ramesh decide to stay together, they of course start with a certain positions. As far as Anita is concerned, that is basically OX, okay. So at no point Anita will bargain anything less than that, okay, because that is her initial starting position. So OX is the, basically you can say, minimum Anita's utility. Similarly, OY is Ramesh's minimum threat point. So see, he won't basically settle for anything less than OY. That is the minimum that he basically even gets without the family also, okay. So in case this whole deal breaks down, so he will anyway end up with OY. So basically, if you draw a line parallel to these 2 points, so then that intersects at T. So T is the basically is the, you can say, threat point, okay. And if you connect this together, so then this AB is the utility possibility frontier. Now AB the downward sloping, but then not all the points on this utility possibility frontier is of interest to us. So what is interest of us is basically that between that segment PQ, okay. PQ is the segment that is basically, you can say, that is the PQ is the segment which is of interest to us, okay. Now, and this relevant segment of the utility possibility frontier is decided by the threat point. Now, if you see, there is something like point C, which is, you can say, is also a solutions where probably so both are better off than without the cooperation. But now they can be, definitely it can be improved upon if you push towards the northeastern side. Basically they can be anywhere between P and Q, okay, on the utility possibility frontier, where either one of them will be better off without making other worse off, or both of them can be better off. Okay, so basically, so C is a Pareto inferior solution, so it has to be on the utility possibility frontier. But then what about point D? D is something which cannot be achieved because it is lying outside the utility possibility frontier. Okay, so this is something that you need to keep in mind, and this we already discussed here. Nash bargain, that is called Nash bargaining solutions. Here basically the Nash bargaining solution proposed by John Nash under some technical assumptions. So what he is saying, he demonstrated that which allocation will finally obtain in the outcome will depend on basically the conditions satisfied by it, which is basically the final solution for Anita should be x is at least as large as capital X. Capital X is the thread point, okay, for Anita. Similarly, Y is basically outcome for Ramesh, which should be also at least as large as capital Y, which is basically the thread point for thread utility for Ramesh. Okay, and then this X and Y combination must lie on the utility possibility frontier. It cannot be below it. That means that is a Pareto inferior solution. Okay, so here you can see again. We have drawn three different levels of utility curve. Okay, so here first one, the more you move towards the Noxian side, you are moving towards the higher and higher utility. Okay, so basically you can say the points or dots along the utility possibility frontiers, you can say, where basically the total utility for the family as a whole remain constant. Okay, so like if you move from the first one is GF. Okay, so if you move along this utility possibility frontier, so here like so from D to E, Anita's utility increase, but to keep the total utility constant, you have to reduce the Ramesh utility. Okay, so as you move along the x-axis, so the Ramesh utility will decline, whereas Anita's will increase. Okay, so basically you can say this is a different combinations of deal that they have come up with, which as a household total utility will remain same, but then individual's utility will differ. Okay, finally where you end up with, that depends on the budget and the thread points, all kind of things. Okay, I will give you one geometrical example. Okay, so let us assume that, I mean, say Anita and say Ramesh. Okay, here names are a little different, Anita and Ramesh. So say like both of them have started with, you can say, they have, you can say, total utility. Anita's thread utility is, let us say, 10. Okay, and Brett and Ramesh total utility is 15. Okay, but then finally the solution that we end up with is X and Y solution is both 20. Okay, so basically minimum utility that A would have agreed, Anita would have agreed with is 10, and Ramesh would have agreed with is 15, but then final solution is 20. So what is the Nash product? Nash product is basically 20 as far as Anita is concerned, 20 minus 10, that is 10, and Ramesh is concerned 15, so basically 20 minus 15, 5. So 5 into 10, basically how much each one of them benefit vis-a-vis their previous positions, and product of that. That is basically, you can say, is a Nash bargaining solution. So 20 minus 10 into 20 minus 15 is equal to 50. That is how we end up with the first indifference curve. Okay, solution that is basically 50. Okay, and so similarly you can conceive of different outcomes which will then take you along this the one indifference curve. Okay, but then finally which one we end up with in terms of market solution, that depends on basically finally, say like all the points along the utility possibility frontier, they are not basically going to be the solutions in the Nash bargaining. Finally the one that is going to be solved, going to be basically as if as a solution, is basically one where difference curve is tangent to the utility possibility frontier. Okay, and here we can see the point S, which is basically tangent to the utility possibility frontier here. Okay, and so solution that we get is Y star and X star. Okay, so this is basically Anita's utility is this X star, and Ramesh utility is, you can say, is a Y star. So finally the solution here is X star minus X is for Anita, and Ramesh is Y star minus Y, And then finally, family as a whole, the solution that we will end up with is x star minus capital X into y star minus capital Y, that is coming from Ramesh. Okay, so this is the solution that we will finally settle with as a part of this Nash bargaining solutions. Okay, so one thing that we are all clear now is that the solution that we finally will get to see also depends on your initial position. Okay, of course, finally, given the initial bargaining threat, you also and someone may end up with different solutions, but then finally one crucial the whole outcome of this bargaining solution is very crucially determined by what is your starting position. If your starting position is very weak, right, here the bargain solution that basically I am talking about here, the T, okay, T in this diagram, okay, T is that intersection point. Okay, so that PT is extremely critical. If you are basically nobody, I mean, you do not have anything, so then T is basically you're going to start with that capital X will be towards the zero. Okay, so you are like you do not have much bargaining, so then solution will be also kind of very suboptimal kind of solutions. Okay, so obviously then the crucial point, the question that we need to ask is what determines this trade utility. Okay, when it comes to women's, what determines basically this trade utility? There are three things that are very crucial and that determine basically the women's positions before they get into this bargain. One is their human capital. Okay, you need to educate them. Okay? Women's education, experience, their skill. Okay, and so all this, and then potential income, all these basically strengthen the bargaining positions. Okay, and they start with a very on a positive note. Same is the case with their ownership. If they have a lot of wealth to begin with, so then they won't care about like, okay, I mean, whether I should get married. Okay, so and what will I get out of this marriage. Okay, so basically this ownership of asset is also extremely important, and same is the case with for a legal framework. In case this solution breaks down, right, the cooperative solution breaks down and decides to get out of this marriage, if it is a very abusive marriage, right, so then like what solution they will she will end up with, that is again is decided by the legal framework, like say inheritance laws, whether she will get, and if this whole relations break down, what will she get out of divorce laws. Okay, so all this will also decide her the worst possible solution, because trade utility is nothing but the worst possible solution in case this cooperative, the NAS bargaining cooperative breakdown. Okay, and all this together basically will really influence or improve the bargaining of women. Okay, so nowadays you can of course see, right, I mean, more and more women are getting educated, and courts rules in favor of allocation of resources, like inheritance law has also changed in favor of women, though it is still not followed in practice in many places, but it is at least now there is a positive noted, right. So all these taken together, basically you can say women's trade utility, you can say, is increasing over time, and that's why, and once that improves significantly, then of course once they enter into kind of some kind of marriage solution, the solution also will of course will improve over time. Okay, so this is something that you need to keep in mind. Okay, so basically what I am trying to say is that, so this brings us into the questions of, so we are basically done with this, the model of Nash bargaining. So the question that we are going to ask is, what determines the women's bargaining power. Okay, so this is something similar to, you can say, the trade utility. Okay, so if women's bargaining power is so important, and that will basically lead to the kind of solution that they end up with in the Nash equilibrium. So the question that we need to answer is, so then what decides, okay, their bargaining power. So there here number of things. One is their income excess, whether they have income earning capacities. Okay, if they have income earning capacity, like no, they can ensure, you by being in the labor market, they can ensure the steady flow of income. So then definitely their basically bargaining power improves. Okay, and you have to give the education and specific skills that is in on demand. Okay, so if there's a new skills have been demanded, and like, so then women need to basically go for those skills. And similarly, basically support systems, overall support system from friends, communities, is everything come together really behind the women, then definitely all this improve the bargaining power, okay, of women's. And these are all economics we are talking about. But then beyond, there are a lot of things that goes beyond basically economics. Okay, these are basically social norms. How do you perceive if say one woman walks out of the marriage? Okay, so this is where basically social norms also very important. Okay, so and also basically you can say social norms also on regarding distribution of properties. Okay, if we overwhelmingly as a society we are like very much against women in terms of distribution of property rights, so then of course then that will have a negative impact on women's bargaining power. Okay, and similarly we also talk about how as a whole like society we perceive women's housework. Okay, are they basically like no, I mean they do a lot of work at home, but then they do not bring them cash, and so we tend to ignore them. I mean we tend to undermine them, and we think that these are all little works that women are anyway supposed to do. Okay, and then that will definitely reduce their bargaining power. Okay, and this also not just within the household, even when they go outside and they basically participate or do the same job that men do, but then perception among the employers is that oh they do not have the same ability, so generally you tend to see they not being paid the same ways as the male members. Okay, and then of course there's another thing is that especially ideology about gender. You can say gender ideology. Okay, so those perceptions about women's contributions, like no, so these like how women should be treated in terms of access to employment, also whether they basically can access the communal resources, all these basically are again shaped by the media. I mean the kind of news they carry, and the image they carry. Okay, and then also educations, and also religious practices, whether they are encouraging of women's movement. Okay, so all these taken together are basically you can say are extremely important, and they also basically say women's bargaining power. Okay, and going beyond these sociological and perception based no and cultural factors, we also have these institutional factors. Okay, so there are basically the problem with the NAS bargaining model is that here we start and end with household, with only one thing that we start take as a starting point, that is a threat point, which is again now is something that is decided not just within household, but then a lot of other factors they come. Okay, but then generally we do not allow the other larger factors that operate beyond the household level to operate within this NAS bargaining framework. Okay, and that is why we're basically discussing this point. And this is here we are talking about the institutional factors, institutional arenas of power. So this also basically influence a woman's bargaining power. Okay, one is basically state. What kind of rules support that state can provide to the women? Okay, in terms of property rights, if the state basically is very vigilant, they want to implement the property rights in favor of women, and also they want to basically the state authority is sensitive towards the gender-based outcome in terms of employment and education. So then that also can really significantly influence the bargaining power. And also this applies to community. Okay, the kin, friends, village group, all together, if they come together and they are kind of supportive of this enforcing social norms, which basically provide some kind of support to the women, so then the bargaining power also improve. And then comes the like market. So labor market conditions like say wage, work intensity, they also basically influence the bargaining power at work and home. Okay, if labor market they basically support. Okay, so like say if state, and this is where basically state and labor market work together, if the minimum wage is set for both male and female the same wage, so then basically that itself is a statement, and then basically the women will have a higher bargaining power. Similarly, say now of course women are not starting on an equal footing. There are many women as a group coming from a different certain particular groups, maybe they are lagging behind. And this is where basically NGOs can play a significant role. They can provide the legal support, they can offer some specific training to the women, raise their awareness level. All this taken together, all these different institutions play their role to basically increase the bargaining power of women. And then just apart from that, there is also you can say how women themselves basically perceive. Okay, many women are you can say they are ambivalent. They do not mind the husband or say also male members in the family getting disproportionate share of everything that they basically within this household. So they think that this is good. Well, I mean, good for the family as a whole, and probably long term the interest of their own interest is also served in the whole process. Okay, so they don't mind basically sacrificing their own immediate consumptions. Like if you see many women, they think they are the last one to consume food, and sometimes even if they go hungry, empty stomach, probably they say, okay, at least my sons, they are doing good. They are well fed now, and they can study well. Probably my turn will come later, or they will take care of me later. So all these kind of things are there. Okay, that influences their decision. Okay, and also there's something you can say is a false consciousness. Okay, so this is again, sometimes you see women's when coming from a very well-off families, they do also lot of you can say sacrifices. Okay, so this basically it is not because of lack of resources. They think that this is something that is norms. Okay, this is, they do not they prefer not to bargain for any or to change this whole deal. Okay, so they think that this is how the system is running, and let it be, I mean. Okay, so they do not question the legitimacy of their own demand. So you can say probably they are probably unaware of that they are equal to the male. Okay, and they deserve much better deal. So probably there's a lack of consciousness. Okay, or you can say a false consciousness that this is how it is, and let us not disturb the apple cart. Okay, so this is how you can see. So finally, what I mean, I am going to discuss about is the autonomy and empowerment. Okay, so here what I am going to talk about is that autonomy and empowerment. This is all very closely interlinked with one another. Okay, and this is again, you have to see through the lens of bargaining power. Okay, so autonomy means that you can exert enormous bargaining power. Okay, and then finally you get an outcome which is very favorable to you. Okay, somehow unfavorable outcome for a woman is almost like rule out if that woman basically exerts her autonomy. Okay, so but then it is easier said than done. Okay, so this requires that you basically challenge the factors that limit a woman's capabilities and choices. Okay, it allow you to basically secure a better outcome for yourself and your family. So basically autonomy, in a sense, I would try to summarize as something that here you basically possess the power, freedom to get the bargaining power required, and which will allow you to get a outcome which is very much favorable to you. Okay, be it in the community market, and everywhere basically. Okay, so you have, and probably there is a supportive institutions, all this coming together to basically give you that bargaining power. Okay, so I'll come to that. But then how does an woman get this kind of autonomy? Okay, why some women get those autonomy while most of her peer groups are lacking those autonomy? Okay, so if you look at a comparative analysis, what we find is that it is again boils down to whether this particular woman who is so like seen as exercising her autonomy, you will find that probably she has a lot of fallback options. Okay, probably there's a lot of properties are already in her name. Okay, she has the resources, and she has the skills that are in demand in the market. Okay, and so she can access the economic opportunities which can ensure a steady flow of income. Okay, and also the external support system, be it state, friend, society, NGOs, all kinds of things, they work together to basically ensure that she can basically get the deal in her favor. Okay, if required. Okay, and so probably in many of these matrilineal society or states which have a very like gender balance policies, so there probably you can kind of expect that external support systems are always also in support of the women's. Okay, so how can you ensure that this women's autonomy is basically is ensured, or how can you basically what I would say is that women's autonomy, that is basically the goal, and you what empowerment is basically is a pathway to ensure that you push that woman towards that goal. Okay, so here it's not easier said than done, but then there are a number of things, there are a number of building blocks towards that goal. One is basically you need the collective action. okay, collective action from the, you can say, women's members, that can also really help. One example that I can give you is bark, okay, that is a the very famous group of women's coming together to form microfinance, and then which allowed them to get actively involved in economic activities, and then they started doing a lot of community bargaining. So overall you can say that women's group has really done enormous things in Bangladesh, and some of the women specific gender based outcomes in Bangladesh are better than in India. Okay, and many people attribute that to basically this whole NGO movement, microfinance movement, which really helped. Okay, and then contesting norms. Okay, if there is some norms which are basically sounds very patriarchal and which basically really, you can say, inhibit their movement, so then again you need to basically change those norms. Okay, and so that it can free the women to do the things that they want to do. Okay, and or you can say like, because say like, say if women cannot go outside their home beyond 5 o'clock, that means that that puts an enormous amount of restrictions on their movement. Probably also that is narrow down the career choice or the things that they can do to basically enhance the capability to explore the economic opportunities. So if you basically contest those norms and make them like bring them on par with the male, so then definitely that will basically make them capable of exercising their autonomy. Okay, and then building awareness. Okay, you need to also raise the awareness, and this is where basically grassroots level of organizations can play a significant role. And finally, none of this will work or achieve much, okay, until unless there's a systemic change which must come from the institutions of governance, that is state, district, or different levels of administration. Okay, and with support from NGOs, all these together should come forward and ensure that women's autonomy is achieved. Okay, so basically gender empowerment is a path, or you can say is a process. Okay, and outcome is the autonomy, and there are a lot of challenges which needs a lot of things to fall in place, which like collective action by women themselves, and then change of societal norms, and then state, NGOs, all different bodies of administrations coming together to basically change the game. Okay, so with this I end the discussion. Thank you.